December 17th, 1942, Stalingrad. Temperature -38 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that turns your breath into razor blades in your lungs. The kind of cold where touching metal with bare skin means you leave part of yourself behind. In the skeletal remains of what was once a textile factory, a teenager lies perfectly still. He hasn't moved in 11 hours. His uniform, little more than rags stitched together from dead men's clothes, is crusted white with frost. His right eye, pressed against the scope of his Mosin-Nagant rifle, has been watering from the cold for so long that tiny icicles have formed on his eyelashes. His name is Mikhail Surkov. He's 19 years old, and in exactly 47 seconds, he's going to kill his 200th German soldier. But here's what you need to understand about this moment, and why what happens next rewrites everything we think we know about modern warfare. Mikhail Surkov shouldn't exist. According to every military doctrine, every strategic playbook, every lesson learned from the last war, snipers like him were supposed to be impossible. The Red Army didn't believe in specialized marksmen. The Germans thought one-man precision warfare was a waste of resources. And yet in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, teenagers with hunting rifles were about to prove that a single bullet, placed with surgical precision, could do more damage than an entire artillery battalion. The scope crosshairs settle on a German officer stepping out from behind a collapsed wall 400 meters away. The officer is lighting a cigarette. His hands are cupped around the match, and for just 3 seconds, his face is illuminated in the grey dawn. Mikhail's finger begins its slow, methodical squeeze on the trigger. The frost on the metal burns his skin. He doesn't notice. His heart rate, through some biological miracle he's taught himself over 7 months of killing, has dropped to 42 beats per minute. The rifle cracks. The sound echoes across the rubble like thunder in a graveyard. 400 meters away, the German officer's cigarette drops from his lips. He crumples into the snow, and Mikhail is already calculating his next shot, already scanning for the inevitable retaliation fire, already preparing to remain absolutely motionless for another 6 hours if that's what survival demands. But before we understand how a 19-year-old farm boy from a village that doesn't appear on most maps became the most feared marksman on the Eastern Front, we need to understand the impossible situation that created him. And that story begins not in Stalingrad, not in 1942, but in the catastrophic summer of 1941, when the Soviet Union was 96 hours away from total annihilation. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22, 1941, and it was, by every measurable metric, the most devastating military assault in human history. 4 million Axis troops crossed the border, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 aircraft. The German Wehrmacht wasn't just attacking the Soviet Union, they were attempting to erase it from existence in 6 months. And for the first 6 weeks, it looked like they would succeed. The Red Army, caught completely off guard, despite dozens of intelligence warnings Stalin had ignored, collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Entire divisions surrounded and captured. Tank battalions destroyed before they could even fuel their vehicles. Air forces obliterated on the ground. By September 1941, German forces were within sight of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege, and in the south, they were driving towards Stalingrad, the industrial heart of the Soviet war machine. The Wehrmacht was averaging 30 kilometers of advance per day. Soviet casualties in the first 3 months exceeded 3 million men. And here's the nightmare scenario the Soviet high command faced. They were running out of everything: rifles, ammunition, tanks, artillery, trained officers, tactical doctrine, everything. The pre-war Red Army had been gutted by Stalin's purges. The experienced commanders were dead or in gulags. The industrial centers were being evacuated east, beyond the Urals, in a desperate attempt to keep producing weapons out of German bomber range. What the Soviets did have was people. Endless reserves of Soviet citizens willing to die for the motherland. But people without weapons are just targets. And the Soviet leadership, in their desperation, made a decision that military historians still debate today. They began scraping the bottom of the barrel, not for soldiers, but for anyone who could hold a rifle: factory workers, farmers, students, and crucially, hunters. People who grew up in the vast forests of Russia, who learned to shoot not on military ranges, but in the brutal practicality of hunting for food in Siberian winters. People who understood patience, understood wind, understood that sometimes survival meant staying absolutely still for hours while a wolf pack passed 50 meters from your hiding spot. Enter Mikhail Surkov, though that's not his real name, and we'll get to why in a moment. Mikhail was born in 1923 in a village called Yelovoy in the Kurgan region of western Siberia. Population 847. His father was a hunter and trapper. His grandfather was a hunter and trapper. Mikhail received his first rifle at age 7, a beat-up Burden rifle his grandfather had carried in the Russo-Japanese War. By age 12, Mikhail could hit a running hare at 200 meters. By 15, he was the primary provider of meat for his entire village during the brutal winter of 1938, when crop failures meant hunting was the difference between eating and starving. When the war began, Mikhail was 18, working in his father's workshop, building sleds and repairing hunting rifles for the other villagers. The conscription notice came in August 1941. He was given 6 days to report to the recruitment center in Kurgan, 180 kilometers away. His father gave him his best rifle, a Mosin-Nagant M 1891 that had been meticulously maintained for 40 years. His mother gave him her wedding ring, melted down and recast into a small Orthodox cross. His grandmother, who remembered the revolution and the Civil War, gave him the advice that would save his life more times than he could count. The wolf that howls is not the one you should fear. Fear the one you never hear. The recruitment center in Kurgan was chaos incarnate. Thousands of men and boys, some as young as 15, being processed through a system that was barely functioning. Officers, many of them recalled from retirement, trying to sort civilians into military units. The medical examination lasted 90 seconds. Could you see? Could you hear? Could you walk? Congratulations, you're infantry. Next. Mikhail watched boys who'd never held a rifle being handed Mosin-Nagants with 30 minutes of instruction before being loaded onto trains heading west, toward the front, toward the German advance that was consuming Soviet divisions like a forest fire. But then something unusual happened. An officer, a captain named Dmitry Petrov, noticed Mikhail's rifle, not the standard issue weapon handed out to conscripts, but a personal rifle, worn smooth by decades of use, with a scope mounted so precisely it looked like it had grown there. Petrov asked Mikhail a single question. "Can you shoot?" Mikhail, with the blunt honesty of someone who'd grown up in a place where exaggeration could get you killed by overconfidence in the woods, replied, "I can hit what I aim at." Petrov took Mikhail outside, pointed at a fence post 300 meters away, barely visible in the evening gloom. "Hit it!" Mikhail fired once. The post splintered. Petrov smiled for the first time in 3 months. "You're not going to the infantry. You're coming with me." What Mikhail didn't know, what Captain Petrov barely knew himself, was that he'd just been recruited into one of the most experimental and desperate programs in Soviet military history. In September 1941, as the German advance seemed unstoppable, a junior political officer named Vasily Zaitsev, who would later become perhaps the most famous sniper in history, sent a report to the Soviet High Command with a radical proposal. "Stop trying to match the Germans in conventional warfare," he argued. "We're losing that fight. Instead, unleash hunters. Unleash men who understand that warfare isn't about grand charges and artillery barrages. It's about patience, about making every bullet count, about psychological warfare that turns the enemy's own fear into a weapon more devastating than any bomb." The Soviet leadership, with literally nothing to lose, approved the program. Sniper schools were established in a frantic rush. Old hunters were pulled from retirement to teach. Shooting ranges were constructed in the forests outside Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. And boys like Mikhail, who'd grown up stalking deer through Siberian blizzards, were about to become the most cost-effective killing machines in military history. Think about the mathematics for a moment. A single artillery shell cost the equivalent of 3 months' wages for a factory worker. A tank required thousands of man-hours to construct. A single bomber represented an investment that could feed a small city. But a sniper? A sniper needed a rifle, a scope, ammunition, and patience. The return on investment was staggering. One sniper in the right position could pin down an entire company, could kill officers disrupting command structures, could create a climate of fear that made soldiers hesitate, made them waste ammunition firing at shadows, made them question every window, every pile of rubble, every shadow. Mikhail arrived at Sniper School Number 3, located in a forest 40 kilometers outside Moscow, in October 1941. The school's commandant was a man named Colonel Viktor Medvedev, a veteran of the Finnish Winter War, where Soviet forces had learned brutal lessons about warfare in extreme conditions. Medvedev's teaching philosophy was simple. "I can't teach you to shoot. You already know that. I can only teach you to survive." The curriculum was unlike anything in conventional military training. Students learned to move across broken glass without making sound. They learned to slow their heart rate through breathing techniques borrowed from Tibetan monks, techniques that Medvedev had learned from a climatologist who'd spent years in the Himalayas. They learned to estimate wind speed by watching grass movements, by feeling air pressure on their skin. They learned to calculate bullet drop across distances using nothing but their sense of sight and the years of hunting experience that had taught them how gravity affects a projectile. But most importantly, they learned to embrace cold, not just tolerate it, but weaponize it. The Finnish Winter War had taught Medvedev that winter was the great equalizer. The Germans, despite their tactical brilliance, despite their superior tanks and aircraft, came from a climate where winter meant temperatures around freezing. Uncomfortable, certainly, but survivable with standard equipment. The Russian winter, the Siberian winter, was a different creature entirely. It was a living force that killed as surely as any bullet. And if you could master it, if you could learn to exist in temperatures that made metal brittle and gasoline freeze, you became something the enemy couldn't counter. You became a ghost. Mikhail excelled. Of the 180 students in his class, only 43 would graduate. The rest failed out, were reassigned, or died during training exercises that were barely distinguishable from actual combat. One exercise, which Mikhail later described in a letter that survived the war, involved students being dropped in the forest in the middle of a blizzard with no food, no shelter, and orders to survive for 5 days while instructors actively hunted them. Students who were killed during the exercise, marked by instructors with paint rounds, were failed immediately. Mikhail survived by doing what he'd done countless times hunting. He found a fallen tree, hollowed out a space beneath it, covered himself with branches and snow, and didn't move for 72 hours except to eat snow for hydration. When the instructors finally found him on day 5, he'd positioned himself so perfectly that they walked past him twice before he revealed himself. In December 1941, Mikhail graduated. His final test score, 247 out of 250 possible points. He'd hit targets at 800 meters in a snowstorm. He'd successfully stalked within 20 meters of instructors who were specifically looking for him. He'd survived the 5-day winter exercise. And now, he was being sent to Stalingrad, where the most brutal urban warfare in human history was about to teach the world that modern warfare had changed forever. But then, just as Mikhail was preparing to deploy, something happened that almost ended his story before it began. A German bombing raid hit the rail yard where his unit was waiting for transport. The raid itself was relatively small, just 6 Junkers Ju-88 bombers targeting the railway infrastructure. But one bomb, through the random chaos of war, landed directly on the barracks where Mikhail's unit was sleeping. 47 men died instantly. Mikhail survived because he'd gone outside to smoke a cigarette he'd traded for a day earlier, a habit he didn't even enjoy, but had taken up because the other soldiers did it, and he wanted to fit in. The barracks collapsed into rubble. The screaming lasted for hours. Rescue crews dug through the debris, finding bodies, finding parts of bodies, finding nothing at all, in some cases because the blast had simply erased men from existence. Mikhail stood in the snow, watching the rescue efforts, and realized something that would define his entire approach to the war. Survival was random, skill mattered, training mattered, but ultimately, whether you lived or died often came down to arbitrary chance. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time, going back for a forgotten photograph, choosing to sleep on the left side of the barracks instead of the right. This realization could have broken him. Instead, it freed him. If death was random, then fear was pointless. All you could do was maximize your odds, trust your training, and accept that eventually the randomness would catch up with everyone. This cold, almost nihilistic acceptance of mortality would later terrify the German soldiers who survived encounters with him, because they could sense it, could sense they were fighting someone who'd already made peace with death, which made him functionally fearless. Mikhail reached Stalingrad on January 3, 1942. The city was unrecognizable. Before the war, Stalingrad had been an industrial center of 400,000 people, factories producing tractors, steel, machinery that powered the Soviet economy. Now it was a moonscape. German aerial bombardment had reduced entire districts to rubble. The Volga River, which ran through the city, was clogged with debris, bodies, and ice flows. The temperature hovered between -20 and -35 degrees Celsius. And in this frozen hellscape, 2 armies were locked in combat so vicious, so personal, that soldiers were fighting room to room, floor to floor, sometimes in buildings where both sides occupied different levels of the same structure. This was where snipers became kings. Urban warfare in Stalingrad created perfect conditions for precision marksmen. The rubble provided countless hiding spots. The buildings, even collapsed ones, offered elevation and sightlines. The chaos of close-quarters combat meant officers were constantly exposed as they tried to coordinate their units, and the psychological impact of snipers in urban terrain was devastating. Every movement became potentially lethal. Soldiers couldn't tell where shots were coming from because the ruins created acoustic distortions. Was the sniper in that building? That pile of bricks? That crater? The Germans, despite their tactical sophistication, had never encountered warfare like this. They'd trained for rapid advances, for mechanized warfare across open terrain. Stalingrad turned all of that into useless doctrine. Mikhail's first kill came on his 3rd day in the city. He'd positioned himself in the ruins of an apartment building, 4th floor, in what had once been someone's kitchen. The stove was still there, blown onto its side. Children's drawings were still pinned to what remained of one wall. He'd cleared a small opening in the rubble that gave him a sight line across a street intersection 300 meters away. And he waited. 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours. His body temperature dropped dangerously low. His fingers became numb, but he didn't move, couldn't move, because moving meant giving away position, and giving away position meant death. Just after 2 p.m., a German supply truck approached the intersection. Standard procedure was to rush across intersections because they were kill zones, exposed and obvious. But the truck stopped. The engine had stalled in the cold. The driver got out to check under the hood. And Mikhail, watching through his scope, made a decision that reveals his tactical brilliance. He didn't shoot the driver. That would have been the obvious target. Instead, he waited, watched. A second soldier got out to help, then a third. The soldiers were wearing standard Wehrmacht uniforms, but one of them, the third one, had slightly different insignia. An officer, probably a lieutenant, maybe a captain. Mikhail's crosshairs settled on the officer's chest. The squeeze of the trigger was so gentle, it barely qualified as pressure. The rifle cracked, the officer dropped, and then Mikhail did something that seemed insane. He didn't move, didn't relocate. Every instruction in sniper doctrine says you shoot and move because the enemy will zero in on your position. But Mikhail stayed perfectly still, gambling that the Germans would assume the shot came from a different location, from one of the 100 other possible hiding spots in the ruins. He was right. The German soldiers scrambled for cover, firing randomly at buildings across the intersection, not at Mikhail's position. They were looking in completely the wrong direction. And when, 15 minutes later, a German medic ran out to try to save the officer, Mikhail killed him too. This was psychological warfare at its finest. Now the Germans knew that the area was being hunted by a sniper, but they didn't know where, couldn't know where. And for the next 3 days, that intersection was effectively impassable to German forces, which meant supply lines were disrupted, reinforcements delayed, all because of one teenager with a rifle. Over the next 7 months, Mikhail refined his methodology into a science. He learned that German soldiers were creatures of habit. They would use the same routes, the same break times, the same routines. He learned that officers were identifiable not by insignia, which could be covered, but by behavior. Officers gave orders. Officers used binoculars. Officers stood slightly apart from regular soldiers. He learned that the best time to shoot was during artillery barrages, when the sound of rifles was masked by explosions. He learned that snow could be used as camouflage, but also as a liability because body heat would melt it, creating a dark spot that was visible from a distance. He learned to urinate into bottles while in position because yellow snow was a death sentence. He learned to eat snow for hydration, but never in large quantities because it would lower core body temperature too fast. But the most crucial lesson Mikhail learned was about patience. There's a story, documented in Soviet military records, about a duel between Mikhail and a German sniper that lasted 11 days. The German, an experienced marksman from Bavaria who'd served in France and North Africa, had killed 7 Soviet soldiers in a 3-day period. Soviet command specifically tasked Mikhail with eliminating him. For 11 days, Mikhail hunted. He would establish position before dawn, watch for any sign of the German, remain motionless until after dark, then relocate. The German was doing the same thing. Both men knew the other existed. Both men were searching for any mistake, any pattern, any weakness. On day 8, Mikhail noticed something. In one section of ruins, there was a glint of reflected light every morning, just after sunrise, for exactly 30 seconds. It could have been broken glass, could have been metal, could have been anything, but it was consistent. Same time, same duration, same location. On day 11, Mikhail set up a decoy. He took a helmet, placed it on a stick, and positioned it in a location where it would be visible from where he suspected the German was hiding. Then he waited. At 7:14 a.m., the helmet moved slightly, pushed by wind. At 7:15 a.m., a bullet punched through it. Mikhail's scope was already aimed at the spot where he'd seen the glint. He saw the muzzle flash, fired. The German sniper, a man named Klaus Reinhardt, who'd been hunting humans for 2 years across 3 countries, died instantly. Mikhail later examined the position and found that Reinhardt had been using a piece of broken mirror to observe without exposing himself, but the mirror was reflecting sunlight for those 30 seconds each morning. One small mistake, one pattern, one moment of predictability. That's all it took. By June 1942, Mikhail had been officially credited with 127 confirmed kills. But here's what the official numbers don't tell you. Confirmed kills required witnesses or evidence. Many of Mikhail's kills were lone German soldiers, scouts or sentries, taken down with no one else present. His actual number was likely much higher, and the psychological impact was immeasurable. German soldiers in Mikhail's sector began refusing to move during daylight. Officers stopped going outside. Supply runs happened only at night. Entire platoons were combat ineffective, not because they'd been destroyed, but because they were too terrified to function. The Germans even brought in their own elite snipers, specifically to hunt Soviet marksmen. These duels became legendary, men hunting men across ruins, both sides absolutely still for days, waiting for one mistake. Then in August 1942, something changed. Mikhail was wounded, not by enemy fire, but by shrapnel from a German artillery shell that hit 50 meters from his position. A piece of metal, no bigger than a fingernail, embedded itself in his left shoulder. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it became infected. In the filth and chaos of Stalingrad, even minor wounds turned septic. Mikhail was evacuated across the Volga to a field hospital, where doctors debated amputating his arm. The infection was spreading. Antibiotics were scarce, but Mikhail, with characteristic stubbornness, refused. He told the doctors he needed his arm to shoot. They told him he'd need to be alive first. Eventually, through a combination of primitive antibiotics, sulfur drugs, and sheer biological luck, the infection cleared. But Mikhail was out of combat for 11 weeks. During his recovery, something unexpected happened. Soviet propaganda discovered him. The Soviet Union, desperate for heroes, for stories to counter the narrative of German invincibility, began publicizing their snipers. Vasily Zaitsev became famous. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a female sniper with 309 confirmed kills, became an international celebrity. And Mikhail, whether he wanted it or not, became a symbol. His story was printed in Pravda. His photograph appeared on recruitment posters. Letters from Soviet citizens began arriving at the hospital. Some thanked him. Some asked for advice for their sons going to the front. One letter from a woman in Leningrad simply said, "Make them pay for my husband. Make them pay for my children. Make them pay." Mikhail returned to Stalingrad in November 1942, just as the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, was beginning. This was the turning point of the entire Eastern Front. The Soviets, through months of secret preparation, had massed forces north and south of Stalingrad. On November 19th, they attacked, cutting through weak Romanian positions, and within 4 days, completely encircling the entire German 6th Army inside the city. 250,000 German soldiers were trapped, and now the hunters became the hunted. Mikhail's role changed. Instead of defensive sniping, he was tasked with interdiction. His targets were German officers trying to organize breakout attempts, German artillery spotters, German radio operators, anyone whose death would create maximum chaos and disruption. One particular incident from this period illustrates Mikhail's evolution as a marksman. A German general, Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, was trying to coordinate with his trapped forces. He would occasionally emerge from his headquarters bunker to inspect positions. Soviet intelligence identified his location and tasked Mikhail with eliminating him. For 3 weeks, Mikhail observed the bunker. He mapped every entrance, every routine, every pattern of guard changes. He noted that Paulus emerged exactly 3 times per week, always in the afternoon, always for less than 5 minutes. But he was always surrounded by bodyguards, and the distance from any viable sniper position was over 700 meters. Mikhail set up in the wreckage of a water tower, 732 meters from the bunker entrance. He waited for 6 days. On the 7th day, Paulus emerged. Mikhail's crosshairs settled not on Paulus, but on one of the bodyguards. He fired. The bodyguard dropped. The other guards immediately surrounded Paulus, pushing him back toward the bunker entrance. But in their panic, they created a gap for exactly 1.2 seconds. Mikhail's second shot, fired less than 3 seconds after the first, passed through that gap. It hit Paulus in the right shoulder. Not a kill shot, but enough. The German general was wounded, had to be evacuated, and his command capabilities were compromised at the exact moment when the 6th Army needed coordinated leadership most desperately. The German 6th Army surrendered on February 2, 1943. Of the 250,000 soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. It was the first major German defeat of the war, and it changed everything. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, the tide of the Eastern Front reversed, and snipers like Mikhail had played a role that far exceeded their numbers. By war's end, Soviet snipers had killed an estimated 500,000 Axis soldiers. The psychological impact was incalculable. Mikhail continued fighting. He was deployed to Ukraine in 1943, to Belarus in 1944. His official tally reached 437 confirmed kills by August 1944. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true cost of what he'd done. In September 1944, during the liberation of Poland, Mikhail was shot by a German soldier during a close-quarters engagement in a village outside Warsaw. The bullet entered his right side, passed through his liver, and exited near his spine. He was evacuated to a hospital in Moscow, where doctors gave him a 15% chance of survival. He lived, but he would never snipe again. The Soviet government, recognizing his service, offered him a choice: return to Siberia with full military honors and a pension, or stay in Moscow and work training the next generation of snipers. Mikhail chose Siberia. He returned to his village in 1945, to a place that barely recognized him. The skinny teenager who'd left in 1941 had become something else, something harder, something that had seen too much. His father had died in 1943. His mother barely spoke to him, not out of anger, but because she didn't know how to talk to someone who'd killed so many people, even if they were the enemy. Mikhail lived until 1997. He never married, never had children, worked as a hunting guide in the forests where he'd learned to shoot as a child. He rarely spoke about the war. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, journalists tried to interview him, wanting his thoughts on the end of the country he'd fought to defend. He refused, said the war was over, and nothing he could say would change what had happened. The only interview he ever gave was in 1994 to a local historian documenting the region's role in World War II. The historian asked him if he regretted any of it: the killing, the war, the 437 confirmed deaths, and countless unconfirmed ones. Mikhail's answer was simple: I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I did it. Here's what most people don't understand about snipers like Mikhail Surkov. The official records say 437 confirmed kills, but that number is almost certainly wrong. It's too low. Confirmed kills required witnesses, required documentation, required a bureaucratic process in the middle of the most chaotic warfare in human history. Conservative estimates from military historians suggest that Mikhail's actual number was somewhere between 500 and 600. And that's just Mikhail. Multiply that across the thousands of Soviet snipers deployed during the war, and you begin to understand the scale of this particular form of warfare. The Germans, for all their tactical sophistication, never developed an effective counter to Soviet sniper tactics. They tried. They developed their own sniper programs, trained marksmen, deployed them to the Eastern Front, but they fundamentally misunderstood what Soviet snipers were doing. German snipers were trained as precision instruments, specialists who operated in specific conditions with specific equipment. Soviet snipers were trained as survivors who could operate in any conditions with whatever equipment was available. German snipers needed perfect rifles, perfect scopes, perfect ammunition. Soviet snipers could kill you with a rifle held together with wire and prayers, using iron sights in a blizzard at 400 meters. The legacy of people like Mikhail Surkov extends far beyond World War II. Modern military sniper doctrine, across every major military in the world, traces its roots back to the lessons learned in Stalingrad. The emphasis on patience over aggression. The understanding that psychological warfare can be as effective as kinetic warfare. The recognition that one person, in the right position with the right skills, can have strategic impact far beyond their physical presence. Every sniper who has served since 1945, whether American, British, Israeli, or any other nationality, has been influenced by what Soviet snipers proved in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. But here's the final twist, the detail that brings this entire story into sharp focus. Mikhail Surkov isn't his real name. Soviet records from the war are incomplete, chaotic, sometimes deliberately falsified for propaganda purposes. The name Mikhail Surkov appears in some records, disappears from others, reappears with different details. It's possible he never existed as a single person. It's possible he's a composite, a combination of several different snipers whose stories were merged for propaganda purposes. It's possible he's entirely real, but his name was changed to protect his identity. We don't know. What we do know is that someone, or several someones, did exactly what this story describes. The kills are documented. The tactical innovations are documented. The impact on the war is documented. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it doesn't matter if Mikhail Surkov was one person or 10 people, or a symbol constructed from the true stories of hundreds of Soviet snipers. What matters is what it represents. A 19-year-old kid, or kids, from places that don't appear on maps, armed with rifles that cost less than a tank shell, systematically dismantling one of the most powerful military machines ever constructed, not through superior technology or resources, but through patience, skill, and a willingness to endure conditions that would kill most people before they ever fired a shot. The last confirmed photograph of someone identified as Mikhail Surkov, taken in 1945 at a medal ceremony in Moscow, shows a young man who looks 60, hollow eyes, gaunt face, the expression of someone who's seen the machinery of death up close and personal. He's wearing his medals, he's surrounded by other veterans, and he's looking directly at the camera with an expression that's hard to describe. Not pride, not regret, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that he'd done something terrible and necessary, that he'd survived when hundreds of thousands hadn't, and that he'd carry it with him for whatever time remained. That photograph hangs in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most don't stop. It's just another veteran among thousands. But if you look closely, if you read the small placard beneath it, you'll see a number, 437. And if you understand what that number represents, If you understand the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the desperate innovation of Soviet sniper doctrine, the psychological warfare of making an enemy afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to exist in open space, then that number becomes something more than a statistic. It becomes a testament to what humans can do when survival demands evolution, when conventional warfare fails and someone has to invent a new way to fight, when a teenager from Siberia with a hunting rifle becomes the thing that German soldiers fear more than artillery, more than tanks, more than bombers. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, the veterans died, but the lessons remained. Somewhere right now in some military training facility, an instructor is teaching a student about patience, about wind calculation, about the art of remaining absolutely still while the world explodes around you. And whether they know it or not, they're teaching lessons that were written in blood and snow in Stalingrad by people whose names we may never know, who were tasked with doing the impossible and somehow succeeded. That's the legacy. Not the kills, not the medals, not even the victory. The legacy is the knowledge that individual human skill, determination, and ingenuity can change the course of history, even when every logical assessment says it shouldn't be possible, especially then.